While the term organic chemistry tends to scare a lot of people off just because of what they've heard from organic chemistry classes, the term really just refers to a study of carbon compounds. And really more specifically, we're looking at compounds that contain both carbon and hydrogen atoms. So if you have a molecule that contains both of those, then we call it an organic molecule. These can be quite simple molecules, and they can range to be quite large. So they can be as simple as what we looked at in chapter 2, which would be methane, which was the carbon surrounded by 4 hydrogens, up to, say, DNA, which is going to have millions of both carbon and hydrogens in it. Now, when we're talking about organic molecules, they're not strictly limited to only having carbon and hydrogen, but those usually are the primary atoms that we find. Now, this slide here is just showing you some variety that we have with regard to organic molecules. Now, methane here at the top, this would be our very simplest of all of the organic molecules. We can have linear molecules. You see a number of linear organic molecules here. Notice that these linear molecules can have double bonds in them. That is very possible. They could have triple bonds there as well. They can have branches in them, which we see down here on the bottom. They can have rings inside of their structures. They can also have other elements in there as well. So that here we see some phosphorus and oxygen. This one down here we see some nitrogen involved. So keep in mind that when we're talking about organic molecules, there's lots of variety. The only rules are really that we need to have some carbon and some hydrogen there. That may be all that they have there, but more often than not, there are going to be a few other elements added in there. And if you keep in mind when we initially introduced the course, we said that carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen were the 4 main elements that we find in living organisms. So a lot of the times we're going to see a little bit of nitrogen and oxygen involved, although as you can see in this case we've got some phosphorus, and there can certainly be other things there. Now, if we introduce the first class of organic molecules, these are what we call the hydrocarbons. Hydrocarbons, just the very term hydrocarbon, ought to tell you what they actually contain. Hydrocarbons are the simplest of all the organic molecules, and they're called hydrocarbons because they only have hydrogen and carbon inside of them. Keeping that in mind, almost all of the molecules you just saw on the previous slide would be considered hydrocarbons. When we're talking about hydrocarbons, every covalent bond that you have is going to either be between carbons and carbons or hydrogens and carbons. That's the only possible combination you can have. Notice that both of those two combinations would be what we call nonpolar covalent bonds, because both carbon and hydrogen are relatively weak electronegatively, and this means that your electrons are going to be held basically right down the middle in these covalent bonds. This means that there will be no separation of charge, which means essentially these are always going to be hydrophobic molecules, or in other words, they are not soluble in water. And that goes back to what we talked about in chapter 3, where hydrophobic molecules have lots of nonpolar covalent bonds. If we just throw up a few examples of hydrocarbons, we've got methane, ethane would be a little larger, and then we have yet another one down there on the bottom. It is important that if you see a bunch of molecules that you can pick out which ones are going to be the hydrocarbons. Keep in mind the structures can be very different, but so long as they only have hydrogen and carbon, we would call them the hydrocarbon. Now, one thing that we do want to introduce is one way that we typically start drawing organic molecules. Now, these are going to be what we call skeletal formulas. Skeletal formulas are formulas that basically just show the skeleton of a molecule. So they're going to be much faster to draw than the typical drawn out structural formula. So if we look at this molecule, for example, we're going to take 4 carbons in a row. It's going to be a hydrocarbon. So every carbon is going to be surrounded by enough hydrogens to give it 4 covalent bonds. Keep in mind that carbon always makes 4 covalent bonds based on its valence shell. It had 4 unpaired electrons. Okay, so here would be my structural formula for this molecule. Now, it took me a little bit of time to draw this molecule, which really is quite a tiny molecule. So if we were to take the same molecule and draw the skeletal formula of this one would simply be that. Now, at first, when you look at that, it probably looks like nothing to you except for a zigzag line. But if we look at it in detail and what it's actually meaning, at each one of these points, whether it is the end or whether it is a corner, that actually represents a carbon. So if we just kind of draw in some carbons on top of it to remind us that that is where the carbons will be located at, notice that we do have 4 carbons. The original molecule has 4 carbons. Now, in addition, we said that every carbon, no matter what, is supposed to have 4 covalent bonds because of that valence shell. So if we don't see 4 covalent bonds there, we know they're there. That means that what we're not seeing is going to be bonds to hydrogens. So if we look at this carbon on the end, we can see 1 line or 1 covalent bond coming off of it. That means that there must be another 3 bonds to hydrogens that are kind of not being shown or being invisible in this case. This carbon here, we see 2 lines coming off, so that means there must be another 2 hydrogens on there. This one on the bottom would have another 2, and this one on the end would have 3. If we just write these hydrogens on here, notice that now every single one of those carbons has 4 bonds coming off of it. And we do have essentially the same molecule that we drew with the drawn out structure. If we look at some other examples, if we had something like this, now we have a ring. It really is no different. Every point is going to be a carbon. So if you look at this one, this molecule actually has 6 carbons in it, 1 on every point. And then if we predict how many hydrogens would actually be coming off of each of these carbons, each carbon we can see 2 lines coming off, 1 off either side. That means that each carbon must have 2 hydrogens. Okay, so won't draw all the H's in, but hopefully you get the idea here. If we look at another example, something like this, this one would have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 carbons. And then if we just look at a few of these, for instance, this carbon right here in the middle, how many hydrogens would that have coming off of it? Well, that one we can actually see 3 lines coming off of that carbon, so that carbon must have just 1 hydrogen coming off. This carbon up here would have 2, this one would have 3, and so on. So hopefully you're getting the idea here with the skeletal formulas. Now, with the skeletal formulas, if there is something besides carbon and hydrogen involved there, then that is something that we do have to have shown. So if we had, for instance, this right here, that would tell us that it is not a carbon at the end of this molecule, but all of the other points are carbons. And every carbon is surrounded by 4 bonds still, so this one would have 2 hydrogens, 2 hydrogens, 2, and then this one over here would have 3. Another example would be something like this. Okay, if we see it in a ring form, we know that at that top point, that's not going to be a carbon, that's going to be an oxygen. So for this molecule right here, we would only have 4 carbons in it. What this means is that if you were to see something drawn like this, this is actually a hydrocarbon, because notice it's just kind of zigzags. We're not seeing any oxygens in there, phosphorus, sulfur. We're not seeing any other letters drawn in. And if we're looking at skeletal formulas and there is something besides carbon and hydrogen, it would have to specifically be drawn on that structure. Make sure that you can identify hydrocarbons if you had them mixed in with a lot of other molecules. Hydrocarbons, we are only looking for the presence of hydrogen and carbon. Now we also want to talk about what we call isomers. Isomers, you do not want to get those confused with isotopes. They are commonly confused with isotopes. Just to refresh our memories, isotopes are atoms that had varying numbers of neutrons. If they had varying numbers of neutrons, that essentially meant that their mass numbers were different. Isomers, now we're talking about molecules that have the same molecular formula but different structures and properties. Okay, so they're going to be made up of the same components, but they're going to be connected together in some different way that's going to vary their overall three-dimensional shape. That will ultimately affect the way that they behave in solution or the way that they interact with other molecules. We will see that one theme throughout this semester is going to be that the shape of a molecule is really crucial for its overall function inside the cell. So isomers would have different properties. One type of isomer is what we call a structural isomer. Structural isomers essentially differ in the covalent arrangement of their atoms. So they're connected together in different ways. If we look at both of these examples, if you count up the number of carbons you have and then also the number of hydrogens that you have, you'll see that both of these are actually C5H12. They do have exactly the same molecular formula. However, if we look at the pictures, we can see that they are clearly different from each other. So their shape is different. In the case of pentane, this one's much more elongated. It's a long linear molecule. The one that we're calling 2-methylbutane, that one is more of a T structure. That's going to be a much more compact molecule. Notice that they are definitely connected together differently. In this example here, if we look, we can see we've got actually one carbon that is connected to 3 other carbons. In this case, we don't have any carbon that's connected to more than 2. So structural isomers do have the same molecular formula, but they differ in the way that their covalent bonds are formed, such that they are connected together in different ways, which alters the overall shape. Now, a second type of isomer that we're going to introduce here is what we call a geometric isomer. Geometric isomers are due to the presence of a double bond and the fact that a double bond is very inflexible. When we have single bonds, then the molecules are free to rotate and kind of spin around. That is not the case when we're talking about double bonds being present. Once there is a double bond present in a molecule, the atoms are basically locked into position so that if one is pointing upward and one is pointing downward, they're basically fixed like that. This leads to basically 2 different types of configurations that we can have. If you look over here, we've got a double bond between these 2 carbons. What that double bond is going to do is it's going to basically lock whatever is attached to those carbons exactly where they're at. So if the 2 hydrogens are pointing up, they will always be up. And if these 2 other groups shown as yellow are pointing down or to the same side of the molecule, they will always be pointing to the same side of the molecule. Keep in mind it's not really an up or down, but it's whether they're on the same side or whether they're on different sides. If they happen to be on the same side, as we see over here, the same is what we call cis. If they happen to be pointed to different sides, that's what we're going to call trans. Okay, so there's 2 types of geometric isomers. We have the cis isomers and we have the trans isomers. Notice that with the cis isomer, we're going to have a much more crowded side to the molecule. And if we have the trans configuration, it's going to be more stretched out where we're not crowded together. Make sure that you know both of the types of isomers, the structural isomers versus the geometric isomers by definition. And if you saw some pictures, you could recognize that what you were looking at were structural isomers or geometric isomers. The last topic in this chapter is what we call the functional groups, often called the reactive groups. It really just depends on the instructor and the textbook. These parts of the molecule that we call the functional groups, these are the parts that give it the function, hence the name. They will take molecules that are very similar to each other, and if you just alter the functional areas, then you have something that behaves very differently. In this picture here, we have two hormones, sexual hormones. We have estradiol on the top, which is a female hormone, and on the bottom we have testosterone. Notice that overall, if you just look at the gray and white parts, they are almost the same. Not exactly, but very close to being the same. The red is a little bit different. That may not even look that different to you, but those are the areas that we would call the functional groups. Because they're different, these molecules take on different roles or do different things. We do have 5 different functional groups that we're going to be going through, and we're going to see them repeatedly, especially in Chapter 5 this semester. There are certainly other functional groups. If you go on to take organic chemistry, we'll talk about those. But we're just going to introduce these 5. You want to be able to recognize them and kind of identify them if they were located within a molecule. The first one is what we call the hydroxyl group. And the hydroxyl group is an oxygen with a hydrogen attached. Keep in mind that this is really what we're looking at if we expanded that. Generally speaking, we don't show that bond between the oxygen and the hydrogen, but it is definitely there. And then this would be connected to some other part of the molecule. Okay, so this is just one little portion that's going to be on the molecule. Here we see an example of it down here. Hydroxyl groups are what makes alcohols alcohols. And we also are going to see them quite a lot in carbohydrates. So when we talk about carbohydrate structure, we'll point out all of the hydroxyl groups that we are going to have. The hydroxyl group is very similar to the hydroxide ion that we talked about previously. The next functional group that you want to make sure you know is what we call the carbonyl or the carbonyl group. This one we have a carbon that has a double bond to an oxygen, and then these other 2 bonds coming off of the carbon are going to be attached to something else. Here we see 2 different examples of where this carbonyl could be located at. We will see the carbonyl group importantly in carbohydrates, although there are certainly other molecules that you can have. A lot of times the molecules are named according to where the carbonyl group actually is contained within the molecule. If it happens to be in the middle, then we call it a ketone, and if it happens to be at the end, we'll call it an aldehyde. That does affect the sugar or carbohydrate naming that we'll get into in Chapter 5. The carboxyl group is a combination of the carbonyl group and the hydroxyl group. In this case, we do have a carbon that has a double bond to an oxygen, and now we are specifically saying that one of the bonds coming off of the carbon has to be to an OH. The other bond will be to something else. Now this carboxyl group, make sure you can differentiate it from the carbonyl group, but this carboxyl group is going to be found in lots of acids. It is an acidic group. If you look down here, basically if you take this molecule, and this is acetic acid, which is essentially vinegar, if you throw that in water, this hydrogen right here tends to come off. So if it comes off, it is basically increasing the hydrogen ion concentration. Well, anytime you increase the hydrogen ions, that's acting like an acid. Okay, so this is an acidic group. We will see it in fatty acids. We'll see it in amino acids as well. So we will be seeing lots of carboxyl groups this semester. Another one to point out is the amino group. The amino group is a nitrogen-containing group. This one has a nitrogen that is attached to 2 hydrogens. This one, because you have polar covalent bonds between your nitrogens and your hydrogens, this means that the nitrogen is a little negative and the hydrogens are a little positive. This means that if you happen to have a hydrogen floating around in solution, it gets attracted to this nitrogen, and we end up with NH3. In this case, we're actually removing hydrogens from solution or decreasing the hydrogen ion concentration, and that would mean acting like a base. The amino group is going to be found in amino acids. So the amino acids will have the amino group, and they'll also have the acidic group that we talked about, which was that carboxyl group. Lastly, we want to introduce the phosphate group. The phosphate group has a phosphorus in the middle. This is going to be surrounded by oxygens. And phosphates we will see as an important part of phospholipids. Phospholipids are going to make up the structural component of all membranes, regardless of where you find them in the cell or the cell type that you find them in. And phosphates are also going to be an extremely important part of nucleic acids, which would be DNA and RNA, and then also an important part of what we call adenosine triphosphate, or in other words, ATP. ATP is going to be an extremely important energy storage molecule inside cells, and we will go into detail on the structure of ATP when we get to chapter 8. Make sure with all 5 of the functional groups that you can recognize the functional groups and identify them if you saw them within a molecule. And then in addition to that, if there's anything special about them, such as them acting like an acid or a base, that you would understand that as well.